Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay, President of the Board of Directors of the City Club. A few weeks ago, President Obama stood beneath the new statue of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall in Washington and dedicated a national memorial to Martin Luther King. President Obama assessed the King legacy and declared that in America's hard times, we know we shall overcome. The president went on to observe that Dr. King would approve of the Occupy Wall Street protests. So the legacy of Dr. King lives on and is an essential element of our national experience and our identity. Today's speaker, Taylor Branch, devoted many years of research and thought to capturing the spirit and the meaning of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life in relation to the tumultuous times that he lived in. The momentous product of this effort is his Pulitzer Prize-winning trilogy, America in the King Years. Mr. Branch reminds us that Dr. King's legacy transcends race and that Dr. King was a leader of all America, not just of African Americans. Many point to the presidency of Barack Obama as a testament to the progress born of the King years. Taylor Branch went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Then he went on to earn an MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Mr. Branch served as an editor at the Washington Monthly, as well as Harper's, and was a columnist for Esquire magazine and has written for many other publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Sport, and the New Republic. Mr. Branch has written several other books, including on Bill Clinton and Bill Russell. He is outspoken in his views. Last month, he wrote a widely discussed cover story in The Atlantic called The Shame of College Sports. This is now an e-book in which he decries exploitation by the NCAA and the, quote, whiff of the plantation, unquote, in revenue-generating major college sports. And you know you're onto a hot topic when you're invited to be a guest on the Colbert Report. Mr. Branch received a 5-year MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, also known as a Genius Grant, and the National Humanities Medal, as well as the Dayton Literary Peace Prize's Lifetime Achievement Award. And in addition to his Pulitzer Prize in History, he has received the National Book Critics Circle Award, the National Book Award, and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, and its Lifetime Achievement Award. Mr. Branch credits Dr. King and his movement with seeing the world from a moral rather than a political perspective. That inspired Mr. Branch to pursue his writing career, and that brings him to us today. Please welcome back to the City Club of Cleveland, Taylor Branch.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm really happy to be back here. I was here in 1990. I'm not sure if it was the same room, but I know I was here 21 years ago. I'm glad to be back. I want to thank KeyBank, thank the City Club of Cleveland for having me back, and chide them only slightly for giving me such a daunting topic, 40 years after Martin Luther King, looking ahead with Obama. You'll have to pardon me because that's inherently provocative, but being provocative is not a bad thing if I can pull it off. I want to begin by telling you that it is unlikely, and it was far from destined, that I would have spent 24 years of my life immersed in studying a black-led freedom movement. I was born in the segregated South, the son of a dry cleaner who didn't care about politics. I grew up desperately trying to avoid the civil rights movement. Everybody that I knew was terrified of it. Grew up in Atlanta. But it wore me down over many, many years. I went to first grade the year of the Brown decision. I finished high school in the year of Freedom Summer, and I finished college in the spring that Dr. King was killed. It was there persistently throughout my whole formative years, and so powerful that against my will it changed the direction of my whole life's interests. To give you a little sense of where I came from, back in the 1950s, my introduction to the race issue and its context was through my dad's dry cleaning plant. I started working there when I was 5 or 6 years old in the early 1950s. The only black people that I knew were in my dad's laundry. Most famously to me, his cleaner named Peter Mitchell, the guy who actually put the clothes in the dry cleaning wheel, would arrive every morning at 6:30 with my dad, and I would get there on my working days. looking like he was dressed to go see the Queen of England, in a three-piece suit and very, very fancy shoes, and he would change clothes. Years later, my dad told me that Peter told him that that was the safest way for a black person to get across the city of Atlanta before dawn in the morning in the segregated South, was be to dress that way. They had an amazing relationship. They shared the rarest of gifts of being able to remember every joke they'd ever heard and know exactly how to tell them. And they had a banter relationship that would not stop, not just telling jokes, but cracking practical jokes. And every morning it would begin with their daily bet on the outcome of our minor league baseball game there in Atlanta. Our team was called the Atlanta Crackers, I kid you not. And Peter bet against the Crackers, and my dad bet for them. And frequently, when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, the three of us would go to Atlanta Crackers baseball games down in Ponce de Leon Ballpark in segregated Atlanta to play the Memphis Chicks and the Chattanooga Lookouts and the other teams in the Southern Association. And all the way down there, my dad and Peter would be cracking these jokes, and I would be laughing and wishing that I could remember any of the jokes that they had just told. But as we got near Ponce de Leon Ballpark, the jokes would begin to die out, and they would get quieter. And when we got out at the ballpark, they had to figure out how to meet up after the game because Peter had to go sit in the colored section. And we would have to get together afterwards. And I remember walking to the game with my dad, and he'd be quiet. And a couple of times he said, "I don't like this." That's all he said. I knew that it was a commentary somehow related to splitting up with Peter and the fact that we weren't joking, but I also knew that it was not political. My dad was never interested in politics. In fact, he raised us on a mantra that anybody who cared about politics couldn't find honest work. And so I knew that he was not bent on changing segregation. In fact, I knew that it was a taboo subject so much that even at 8 years old, I knew not to ask a single follow-up question, like, "What does that mean, Dad?" or "Why don't you like that?" Because I knew that the race issue then was so radioactive and so fearful that ordinary commentary and ordinary talk, even between a father and son, was utterly stifled. It was in every breath that you drew. And so is the liberation since in every breath that people draw and take for granted since. Peter died not long after that from those Camels that he smoked. And my father and I went to the funeral. I was maybe 10 years old. It's the first time I'd ever been in a black church. My eyes were big as saucers because it seemed to me that people were having heart attacks every 30 seconds. And they were falling over, and then these ladies dressed in nurses, it looked like nurses' uniforms, would come running down the aisle. They had sashes, green sashes, and they would haul them out and everything. And I was astonished by this. And my dad and I were the only two white people in the church. And then the preacher said, "I see Mr. Branch is here. Would he like to come to the pulpit and say a few words?" I was even more astonished by that. I never saw my dad make another public speech in his whole life. He went up to the pulpit and completely broke down, talking about his relationship with Peter. And this is one of the things that began to start working at me, because I knew they had an extraordinary relationship, but I had never been in Peter's home, didn't know very much about his family, and he had never been in our home. That's what it was like, this kind of intimate, stranger, fear relationship that was there. Nobody in his right mind thought that the United States could deal with the race issue in the late 1950s when I was growing up then. Not a single elected official in the 17 states of the old Confederacy advocated change in the segregation laws. And yet, by 1964, we were going through transformation so profound that they, to this day, are enshrouded in myths. At least that's what I want to argue before you today by way of sketching the challenge looking ahead with President Obama. By the summer of 1964, when I was headed off for college, Dr. King's movement, largely and often led by college students that people could not believe were tackling problems that reduced Dwight D. Eisenhower to mumbles, The college students were doing it. They weren't panty raids, the sit-ins. They were real. And they had elevated politics to confront a civil rights bill in 1964 that nobody believed was possible. A United States senator stood up in that summer of '64, the great watershed summer, to deliver a prophetic speech. The Democratic Party has abandoned the people, he said. It has repudiated the Constitution of the United States to become the party of minority groups, power-hungry union leaders, political bosses, and big businessmen looking for government contracts and favors. The party of our fathers is dead. Those who took its name are engaged in another reconstruction, this time not only of the South, but of the entire nation. If the American people permit the Democratic Party to return to power, freedom as we have known it in this country is doomed, and individuals will be destined to live lives of regulation, control, coercion, intimidation, and subservience to a power elite who shall rule from Washington. Fortunately, there is another choice. For me, there is no alternative. The future of freedom and constitutional government is at stake, and this requires that I do everything in my power to help Barry Goldwater return our nation to constitutional government. That was Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, becoming the first of Democratic South to switch parties and become a Republican. There were no Republicans in elected office between Texas and the Atlantic Ocean in the South then. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. Republicans were as scarce as polar bears. Over 80% of Republicans in Congress had just voted for the groundbreaking civil rights bill that passed Congress in 1964. And yet, at that moment, the Democratic Convention meeting in San Francisco expelled all the black and tan delegates who had been coming to Republican conventions for 100 years. And Barry Goldwater won the nomination after his decisive announcement that he would vote against the Civil Rights Bill. He won the nomination by carrying the most diverse state in the country, the Republican primary in California, with a delegation that did not include a single minority person. It was an all-white delegation. This was a sign of a future. This was hidden from view, but it was a sign of the future turning on a dime. That same summer, in August, in Atlantic City, the Democrats met, and Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi stood up and pleaded for a delegation to be seated that had black folks in it. And Lyndon Johnson went on TV to supersede her and get her off because he was terrified that her face, as eloquent as she was, would be taken for the face of the Democratic Party, and threw her off. Martin Luther King was at that convention agonizing in balance about whether to go with Lyndon Johnson, who was trying to move the Democrats, who had always been the party of segregation and the solid South. And no Democratic president thought they could win without the support of the segregated South. But he had just put in the Civil Rights Bill, and he was trying to move gradually. So seat the white delegation from Mississippi and promise the black delegations justice in the future. The black delegation walked out. They asked Martin Luther King his advice. He said, as a national leader, I would want you to take this for gradual change because the Democratic Party is changing and the Republican Party is changing, and who knows, we shouldn't be tied to either party. For this, he was roundly reputed by the movement people as a sellout, for somebody who did not want to walk out and give up on the Democratic Party forever and on the promise of national politics. Only 9 months later in Selma, Dr. King was in the crucible of balance over the direction of the change to come. Many of you know there were 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery. 2 of them were famous. The most famous was Bloody Sunday, when they were beaten, 600 people beaten on the Pettus Bridge just before they even got out of Selma. By the end of that month, there was another march when they actually marched the whole 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery, and Dr. King made a famous speech, how long, not long, will it take before we can achieve the promise of democracy and win the vote. In between those 2 marches was the more important one. the turnaround march on March 9th, only 2 days after Bloody Sunday, when he had appealed to clergy from the entire country to come and take up a march right on the spot where the marchers had been beaten 2 days before. And nearly 1,000 clergymen came from as far away as Alaska and Maine to be standing there where the marchers were beaten and march. But in between, a federal judge issued an injunction saying, "You shall not march until I hold a hearing on whether this is fair." And Dr. King was in a terrible crucible. He had invited all of these people to come. He's told to wait. If he has to wait, the movement will dissipate. This is the only chance he has to change the nation. The federal government is coming there to say, if you violate a federal injunction, the courts will turn against you. The President of the United States will hold you in contempt rather than become your ally. And the Congress will abandon the efforts to pass a Voting Rights Act. He was dealing with all three branches of government, clandestinely with the judge, with a number of legislators, and directly with the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. What do I do? The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, was trying to trap him into violating the order and getting out in the middle of nowhere, marching through Lowndes County, Alabama, which had 70% black people and no registered voter in the entire 20th century, one of the most backward and terrorized counties in the United States. So what did he do? He went across the bridge. The troops were there, and just at the moment when he was deciding what to do, Governor Wallace had the troops part the way. They no longer blocked the way. The way was open. He could march through and violate the injunction, or he could not. He had people behind him, some of whom were terrified, some of whom did not want to break the law, and others of whom, the younger people, said, "We're going to march through hell or high water. We don't care what the government said." Dr. King said, "We will have a prayer and we will turn around and go back to the church." As they turned around, a sarcastic song went up, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," from people making fun of him for giving way the spirit of the movement and the willingness to die on the promise of politics. Many people said they never trusted Martin Luther King from that moment forward. On the other hand, this was the balance between holding together a movement of moral protest and moral force and holding together the promise of a government that would enact the footholds of this movement in the Voting Rights Act. Just a few days later, Judge Johnson withdrew his injunction, ordered Alabama to protect the marchers, which they refused to do. And Lyndon Johnson went before the Congress and said, "We shall overcome and introduce the Voting Rights Act," which became law. People in the movement still did not trust Dr. King, and in fact, because Lyndon Johnson was simultaneously starting the Vietnam War, and because it had taken so long for the federal government to answer this, they said the Voting Rights Act can't be any good because it came from the federal government. These people denounced the word liberal and said liberals were sellouts and will never again be trusted, long before Strom Thurmond's party made conservative enshrined as the watchword of our politics that spread from brand new Southern Republicans to national leadership among Republicans and is enshrined today by Fox News. This is the kind of balance and myth that we need to understand and that President Obama faces today. Dr. King understood that a movement needed also to be operating within the context of fundamental democracy, a government of checks and balances. And that we have today a government of checks and very little balance. What balance means is that you have to have balance if you want to accomplish a purpose. A check means that you are prudent. Balance means you are efficient. A check means that you are not tyrannical. Balance means that you can accomplish great miracles. And patriotism in the United States has always been, since the days of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and indeed this movement. Patriotism has always been about purifying and refining a government of checks and balances to tackle intractable problems by lifting up and upholding the government. That's what makes the flag wave, not deriding it. The first thing that Obama will have to do today is to restore balance, not just in the sense of checks and balances, which made Martin Luther King a modern founder for all of us, doing just what Washington and Jefferson did, confronting systems of oppression and setting in motion equal citizenship that became freedom to light the world. That's what he did. But to restore that kind of balance in a government now that is, and politics that is paralyzed by checks, the first thing you have to do is to restore balance about history. Surely the history that I have sketched to you is not the history of government run amok ever since, as people would have us believe. It let loose miracles that we still value. Senator Russell and Senator Thurmond said it was going to cripple the economy of the South by reducing the garden variety white Southerner to a pauper if they had to treat African Americans fairly. Surely this is wrong. You never heard of the Sun Belt when the South was segregated. It became an economic miracle, and as Dr. King said, it is history's wry paradox that when black people are liberated from the injustice of segregation, so too white Southerners will for the first time be liberated from psychological, political, and economic chains. The white South spread. My mayor, Ivan Allen, said that we built in Atlanta a baseball stadium on land we didn't own with money we didn't have for a team we hadn't found, and within a year lured the Milwaukee Braves to Atlanta to become the first professional baseball team in the South once segregation was gone. It liberated the whole South. It made Southern white leaders, even who opposed the civil rights movement, eligible for national office for the first time. They were no longer stigmatized. It liberated women across the board when it set those things in motion. When I went to North Carolina, women by state law were not allowed to go to the state university unless they were nursing students. Student body was 5% female. If we really felt that the changes set in motion from the civil rights movement that have liberated women, the disabled people, elderly people, along with black folks, if we really felt that they were bad and the product of tyranny, we could undo them. We could kick the women out of Harvard and Princeton and West Point and all the places that they've gone and all the professions that were closed to them then. For 2,000 years, Rabbinic Judaism, nobody had even dreamed of a female rabbi until the civil rights movement began contesting what equal souls and equal votes really mean. And now we take rabbis, female rabbis and cantors for granted. You wouldn't want to undo these things, nor would you want to undo the blessings that spread all around the world, such that they were singing "We Shall Overcome" when the Berlin Wall came down. And they were singing "We Shall Overcome" in South Africa when apartheid dissolved, not with nuclear weapons, but with a democratic movement. Or even Tiananmen Square, where kids stood in front of tanks in the spirit of the sit-ins, inspired by the United States. These are great, great miracles of freedom, and it will require a sense of balance in President Obama, from President Obama, but mostly from us, to get a sense of how our history is accurate, how it impinges on our politics, in order to be able to tackle the intractable problems again that face this country. If I'm right that the economic problems that are facing our country are not a mere blip in the business cycle, but these are historical things that have been gathering for a long time, they are not the product of overbearing, tyrannical government. They're the product of the fact that we are integrated into a global economy and that many of our older industries have been replaced for the benefit of the world, but at the cost of great dislocation and pain here. To adjust to those things, we need to have exactly the kind of miracles and exactly the kind of boldness and exactly the kind of belief in the promise of democratic government that the civil rights movement had 50 years ago to lift us into freedom from problems that were so terrifying that me and my dad and I could not even talk about them. So we need to restore balance in our history, in our conception of government, of checks and balances, liberals and conservatives. No one was more conservative and disciplined than a freedom rider facing someone about to beat them and saying, "You may beat me, but our children will establish human contact because of what we're doing today." Dr. King said the essence of the democratic promise is that we can be self-governing and that we can build public trust. If we can do both of those things together, conservative and liberal, we can work miracles. But we are badly out of balance today because we're all checks. We're no balance. We are out of balance with our history. We have a miraculous fact of a black president that no one believes would happen, but he's also inherited a terrible economy. Is that because of our distortions, his fault, or the fact that we are facing really, really intractable problems that we need to retool ourselves to address? I say that we need to restore balance. It's an elementary part, not just of good history, but of democratic government, which is the great promise to the world. Therefore, it is a tragedy that our students score lower on history than on any other subject, by far. They are not taught civics. They are not imbued with the miracle and wonder of the story of American freedom as promised through our system of government. We denigrate our own system of government at our peril. I believe that this is not a misjudgment. If it were merely a misjudgment, we could correct it. I believe that it comes more from cynicism and despair. Those are not misjudgments. Those are an appetite. They are something embedded in our will. They are harder to get at. And the movement had to have not only truth on its side, but it had to have a movement, it had to have extraordinary leadership, and it had to be willing to make sacrifices. If we can do that again, if President Obama or his opponent, in my view, whichever one, restores our balance in history and the balance that we have to be able to tackle large problems, then we can overcome the cynicism that has paralyzed us. We can tackle great problems again, and we can restore hope. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a Friday forum featuring author and journalist Taylor Branch. We will return to our speaker in a minute for our traditional City Club questions and answers. Please formulate your questions now and do keep them brief. In 2012, the City Club of Cleveland will turn 100 years old. We're planning a number of events, and we will be actively soliciting support from the community through our campaign for a new century. To learn more about our 100th anniversary events, visit the City Club website, www.cityclub.org/100. And please become a member of the City Club if you are not already a member. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. For more information about our upcoming forums, please refer to our website or the back of your printed program. If you wish to make reservations or order a CD or DVD of today's program, please call 1-888-223-6786 or 216-621-0082. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, Case Western Reserve University, and Key Bank. Thank you for joining us today. Today's program is also part of the 2011 Key Bank Diversity Thought Leadership Series. At the head table today are Margot Copeland, Executive Vice President, Director, Corporate Diversity and Philanthropy, and Mark Williams, Executive Vice President and Head of Key Merchant Services. Will you please stand and be recognized? We are also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club Student Program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Charles Spar Foundation. With us today are students from St. Ignatius High School, St. Martin de Porres High School, and Shaw High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and Special Initiatives Coordinator Phil Williams. First question, please.
Good afternoon, sir. First of all, I enjoyed your comments on the HBO Harry Belafonte's documentary. My first question is that, well, actually, my question is this, rather, is that you made reference to restoring balance. Now, you used we talked about the civil rights movement, okay? But your recent article in Atlantic magazine where you talked about college sports is more like a plantation, and you're saying that you should pay college athletes for all the revenue that you generate in college sports. Now that you can turn on like ESPN, every day you find out there's a big school jumping to another conference. It seems like everything is a big mess. My question is this. Do you think college sports need some type of federal intervention similar to the civil rights movement to restoring balance, if you will, back into college sports?
Well, that's a big leap. I should tell you that the civil rights movement was my life's work, and I wanted to do a little toss-off assignment for the Atlantic, and they wanted me to do something odd for me, and so I went into the world of college sports, and I feel like I've been on a spacewalk ever since it came out, because doing all of these new strange things. Balance. It is true that balance is not the first thing you think is needed in college sports, although the key question is, can big-time sports be balanced with quality education? Okay, that is the key question. We are the only country in the world that has big-time sports in institutions of higher learning, the only one. And my article, which is now an ebook called The Cartel, describes how that happened. It's largely an accident of history. But we can't even begin the debate about whether these things are compatible so long as we pretend that the problem in college sports is dirty athletes who get a little bit of the money that they generate. They're unbelievably gifted, talented people. We haven't addressed the basic question, which in some senses is what it does have something in common with the civil rights movement, in the sense that there are issues of equity. The NCAA excludes athletes from membership. They do not have a vote. They do not have a voice. The only voices are the institutions that make regulations for other people and basically make regulations that keep all the money for the adults. And then they have the gall to say that they're doing this for the athletes' own good because it would exploit them if they got any of the tangible benefits of what they are doing. They'd be deprived of the blessings of pure amateurism. So this is a very, very strange world. And to have some sort of balance in which the athletes are treated with the respect that they deserve, if you are pursuing any college athlete, and I'm not talking about just football or basketball, a woman soccer player, volleyball player, a swimmer, these are incredibly demanding and gifting things that they pursue all year round, and they're also trying to be students. But we tend to think of them as people at the circus who should stay over in the jock dorm and not bother us. And we cheer and boo them. They deserve the respect of fellow citizens and to be at the table when we try to make these decisions about how college sports should be operated. And in that sense, it is like the civil rights movement. They have no representation. They have no rights. We call them a student athlete, but basically that just means a creature that the NCAA should be in charge of. A special creature. So, yeah, there are basic issues of equity, but I am by no means suggesting here that they are as significant as the constitutional questions and the questions of government and our entire economy. I guess you could argue maybe that college sports might be one of the last bubbles because the amounts of money have just been skyrocketing the way real estate prices used to. But it's on a smaller scale. It's on a smaller scale to everybody unless you happen to be one of those players or unless you happen to be a professor in one of these universities. I had university professors tell me, they wouldn't let me attribute it to them, but several of them told me that their salaries are 3, maybe 4 times what they would be, were it not for the fact that their trustees were too embarrassed to have such a gap between them and the football coach. So this seeps everywhere. It seeps everywhere. And the sad thing is that the adults who get this money wind up convincing themselves that they deserve every penny, even though it's the kids out there on the field and on the court risking their bodies and mesmerizing us with their incredible talents and performances that are anything but amateur. Yes, sir.
Mr. Branch, you spoke repeatedly today about restoring balance, and certainly that's a worthy goal, and it's very evident in the deliberations of the United States Congress. Unfortunately, the Republican Party has taken a position that the most important thing to do between now and the next election is to keep President Obama from being reelected. In view of that dogma, how is it possible between now and November of next year to restore balance to our United States Congress?
The way to restore balance is often up to the citizens. The citizens are the ones that are responsible for this government. It's ours. And if it fails, part of the blame is ours. If you allow a party or a candidate essentially to have no constructive purpose in government and you vote them in, I mean, to me, the only look, the country would do really wonderfully if a constructive Republican candidate were to say we're at the end of the road of just saying that all we can do to solve our problems is to shut the government down. We have to have a more constructive purpose than that. But if they don't, then the voters have to restore the balance by saying we are in a crisis that's serious enough that we can't pretend that we can get out of it simply by doing nothing and shutting down the government. So I think the citizens are responsible for it, and again, I think that's one reason that that the civil rights movement is such an amazing model. They didn't wait for politicians to solve and to address the problems of segregation. They had sit-ins. They had freedom rides. When the Freedom Riders were beaten on Mother's Day in Birmingham, kids from Nashville said we should go take their place. It's up to us, not to write a petition or to have a plan for some office holder to address it. They addressed it themselves. Years later, I asked Diane Nash, whose idea that was, about something. The FBI did some nasty things to her family, and I asked her if she resented it, and she said, "Well, yes, it hurt our family, but that's our fault." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, we left J. Edgar Hoover in a position of secret authority for 50 years. And we got exactly what anybody who studied the Constitutional Convention for 1 week would tell you you're going to get. You're going to get somebody that abuses power. So I hold us responsible." Now that, she couldn't even vote herself and was 22, 23 years old, and yet she's taking a citizen's notion of balance and responsibility for the country that I think is a model for us now. We all just sit around and cuss and say, if politicians weren't such jerks, I'd be better off. We have to take responsibility for that ourselves and restore the balance. There are times when the citizens have to do it. That's one of the things that makes Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party more cousins than they'd like to think. Neither one of them knows where to go, but both of them sense that there's something fundamentally wrong and that the citizens need to do something about it. And in that sense, I think they framed the question right. We are a government of all checks, and where people say that we're in a cynical age, but just as though that's the end of the conversation, as though the beginning of a conversation about how we cannot submit to that. Yes, ma'am.
So this weekend I have the pleasure of supervising my 8-year-old as he finishes a project on great leaders. And he has to create trading cards that very concisely identify the leadership qualities and their impact on society. What should I tell him to write about Dr. King?
About that Dr. King used both the power of words and the power of witness. Because he said his first great lesson was that there are some things in life for which words alone are not enough. He knew he was a gifted orator, but it wasn't working. And he amplified that with sacrifice in the interest of what he called redeeming the soul of democracy by treating everyone as an equal citizen. And that's patriotic, and in that sense he really is patriotic. And he was balanced in the sense, if you go and look at Dr. King's rhetoric, if you go and look at his sermons over many years, you will be surprised by how many times he paired our secular and our religious heritage. We will, what I call equal souls and equal votes. He was balanced in the sense that he's saying freedom and equal citizenship, and the balance that we need here is because of our heritage of equal souls, that we treat each other equally, and our heritage of equal votes. Democracy is nothing but a cathedral of equal votes, and it's the way we solve things. And always he would in his rhetoric, we will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. So we'd always put one foot in the Constitution and the other foot in the Bible. And because he was so balanced, he pulled off another miracle, which was that he talked about church and state every day and was never attacked by his worst enemy for mixing church and state. That's an amazing feat. And he did it because he wasn't trying to subdue one with the other, which is what most people want to do. They want to kick the church out of politics, or they want to have the church run politics. He didn't do either one. He just basically said, come in either way. So for children, I would say he never held elected office. He never sought elected office. He never even endorsed a presidential candidate because he wanted the parties to be balanced, and both of them addressed this thing. He didn't even endorse officially Lyndon Johnson against Goldwater, although he did warn that Goldwater would be a disaster. So I would say he's a citizen who really took citizenship seriously and studied the underpinnings of democracy and where it comes from, and only by doing that, in that ways that Diane Nash and other these kids stayed up all night trying to dissect the promise of democracy and figure out how to make it real and to confront people who said they believed in democracy with the contradictions because they thought that would be productive. And in that sense, Dr. King was a citizen who felt that justice was up to all of us and not just to the people who hold high office. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm on the Cleveland Advisory Board of Facing History and Ourselves. I know you've spoken at their events. How do we get more history classes? A recent high school student said, I took 10 science classes, 10 math classes, but I took one Facing History class to teach me to be a citizen of the world. So what advice would you give to get more history into our schools?
This is a great challenge. I'm actually working on it a lot myself, and I hold myself accountable in a way in my little corner of history, the civil rights corner, because all I've offered teachers are big fat history books that they're not likely to assign to their students. I'm trying to figure out a way to break it up into stories. I think kids get involved through stories. You have to have stories, but they have to have some context for the teacher to raise questions to discuss. So I'm working with a foundation trying to break up my trilogy into 150 small stories that will be downloadable by teachers for free on the web. Because right now what we have is a perfect storm of disaster in that school budgets are tightened, textbooks are terrible, they're very expensive, they don't have stories in them, they're a maze of dates and generalized trends, they're politicized. The schools, because they are measured on their performance in reading and math, but not in history, inevitably devote more resources and they're better teachers to those subjects and not to history. So in many respects, these things converge on our history, and we do. And I think Americans really take democracy for granted and assume that we don't need to teach it because democracy is us, and we've been doing it for 200 years, so we must know how to do it. And that's true for certain assumptions that we have. We would all be shocked if we had an election and a unit from the Pentagon marched in to take over the White House instead and didn't like it. We'd be shocked. We live all of those things. But the great lesson from history and from the civil rights movement is that the people who created democracy said, this is a very difficult experiment, and it challenges all our brains, all our hearts, and everything as citizens. James Madison said, when what is politics but the greatest of all meditations on human nature, when he was trying to figure out how to make a democratic system work. So, I think we need a citizens movement to take history more seriously as part of civics and not take it for granted. And, if I had any say in it, I would evaluate schools on the teaching of history, too. I mean, we have kids in our high schools today commonly don't have a clue about the most basic things that we assume are important on this. And to change that, we've all got to take history more seriously. And I'm not saying that just because I love and write about history. Yes, sir.
Mr. Branch, one of the outcomes of the Voting Rights Act of '64 and the subsequent acts that enhanced that was the creation of majority-minority districts. In your view, has the fact of black majority districts enhanced or decreased the voting power of black people?
That is a very sensitive and interesting tension, because I think, speaking bluntly as a historian, I would have to say that it's been more suited and designed by the politicians themselves than by the voters. Every politician wants the safest possible district, and consequently there are devil's bargains to be made, meaning strip all of my potential constituents out of your districts so that it can guarantee that people, my political opponents, are secure, but make me secure. You can argue that the voting power would be maximized by if you maximize the number of 50-50 districts that really go back and forth depending on how responsible people are to the will of the people. That is not the way the system is geared now. And in fact, there is very little attention to forward-thinking things to secure and to protect and encourage the right to vote. The right to vote in the United States is still conceived of in law and in politics negatively. That is, prohibiting things that inhibit the right to vote at times. But we don't have things, people raising questions about apportionment, about when we vote, how we vote, and so forth, in a way that encourages democracy as a positive duty of democracy. We're still trying to prohibit discrimination, which is a limited view. And in fact, John Lewis and I it's on my website, if you're not long ago, had a discussion at the Constitution Society in Washington about this, saying that essentially, as much as it's important to preserve the Voting Rights Act, it's also important to recognize that the Voting Rights Act is dated. It applies only to a small portion of the country. Eventually, it has flaws, and eventually might get superseded. And we need, rather than looking backward to defend that, we need to be looking forward about new things to advance in a technological age. Questions of identity are all consumed in issues of voter fraud and voter intimidation, voter suppression. Nobody on its face supports voter suppression. But right now, we do not have an active public debate about how we encourage the positive duty of voting and make every vote safe, secure, and encouraged so that we can reverse the downward trends in voter participation, which are a symptom of the cynicism that I was talking about. So, yes, I think you're talking about a symptom of complacency, as it were, in our whole approach. The Voting Rights Act was a great landmark for its time. It really changed things in a very fundamental way. But we do have to recognize that a lot of things have changed since then, and it was regional. It didn't even apply to all the counties in the South, and only in the South. And one thing Dr. King proved was that racial prejudice in the United States was not and never has been a purely sectional problem. And therefore a broader approach is necessary, and one looking forward and more to encourage voting, fair voting, every vote counted accurately, every district drawn fairly. these are tough, again, like I was talking about with history, these are tough intellectual problems. The people with the very best of intentions have a hard time solving them, but right now there's not much attention to them at all. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Ashante from St. Martin de Porres High School, and I want to know, how do you feel that the American dream from the 1950s differs from the American dream now?
Whew. Well, things that people in the 1950s never thought were, never dreamed of, have come true in the comforts of our daily lives. A room like this, where I grew up, where we have people from different backgrounds, I guarantee everybody would have sweaty palms for fear that either the Klan or the police would come in. So things have changed a lot in ways that we couldn't imagine. But I will say this: if you look back in the 1950s, and I see a few of you who have my hairdo, and might remember this. There was an amazing sense of optimism in that period, even in the midst of a much poorer country and one bedeviled by a lot of political problems. We had just come through World War II. We had just licked polio. We were thinking about going to the moon, the space, make 58 great, hit the moon soon, right after Sputnik. There was a sense of optimism and can-do that I don't know was projected through the government, although in those days the trust for government was high, even though the government had no pretense that it was going to tackle the race issue. So today I think there is less optimism about the American dream than there was 50 years ago. Even though there are so many more resources, and this is an immensely wealthier and freer country. We restricted in the 1950s, we restricted immigration. I'm not talking about illegal immigration. Everybody's involved in illegal immigration. But we restricted legal immigration by race. And since the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which I call the third great pillar of the Civil Rights era, with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, it repealed all of the national origins limitations that had reserved legal spots for immigrants. 80% of them were reserved to England, Ireland, and Germany. All of sub-Saharan Africa had a quota of 0. Asia was blank. You had no Asian families. Lyndon Johnson went before the Statue of Liberty and said, this is repealed. From now on, legal immigration to the United States will be on a first-come, first-served basis to the whole world, and no foreigner is too foreign to be a fellow citizen. Changes like that are largely invisible unless you drive around in neighborhoods that didn't exist back then, and have made us the world's only functioning multi-ethnic democracy in the world. So we have things to be optimistic about, but I think partly because of the economy and partly because we didn't just lick Hitler and Japan at once, we don't have the same sense of optimism that we had back in the 1950s, and in that sense the American dream is clouded. Yes, sir.
Hello. My name is Jawan from Shaw High School. My question is, being very active in civil rights, fighting for black equality, what adversity did you face from your white peers, especially with increased hate groups?
First of all, I was not very active in the civil rights movement. I was mostly a kid. I was waking up to it, as I said. I did work for the Voter Education Project in 1969, but by then I was 22. I got arrested in a place called Bubba Doo's Big Apple in Cuthbert, Georgia, for being on the wrong side of town trying to register voters. So I had a little tiny taste of it, but I was late to the civil rights movement. I aspired to it. And in a way, later on, I decided that that was a good thing, because if I'd been part of it inevitably and wanted to write, I would have written about my part. So I had a little feel for it and a lot of friends, but I was basically not experienced in it. Now, as a writer, having devoted my life to it, there have been problems, not only in gaining access. I talked about this a little yesterday. There were a lot of people who said, well, we want to write our own history. why do we want some white guy to come write about the civil rights movement? And I said, well, the civil rights movement was for the whole country, and I've been writing books. Do you think that I could run a successful social movement? And they said no, and I said, well, just because you ran a successful social movement doesn't mean you can write books either. They're two different things. But over time, you have to wear people down, and some people said that actually being an outsider to the movement made me more perceptive about things that they took for granted. So that was good. But I get attacked regularly, not viciously, and it's been going on so long now, I don't really notice it, just for the things that I write. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to a Friday forum featuring Taylor Branch. Thank you, Mr. Branch. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.